Hello, and welcome to the inaugural World War II Emerging Scholars Symposium. My name is Joy Murphy. I am the Education Specialist for the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. We are pleased to have the Eisenhower, Roosevelt, and Truman Libraries work together in creating this platform for new scholars. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Jorden Pitt. He is going to speak with us a little bit about flight neuroses in World War II.
Good morning, everyone. As Joy so kindly mentioned, my name is Jorden Pitt, and I am currently a PhD student down at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. And first off, I just want to express my gratitude to the Eisenhower, Truman, and Roosevelt Presidential Libraries for allowing us to have this opportunity to share our research. I know that we have dedicated so much time and put so much effort into it that it is a great opportunity to be able to share it with others. So to begin, the title of my presentation this morning is Flight Neuroses in World War II. And now when you see that word neuroses, I'm sure your eyes glaze over, because when we get into definitions of psychology or psychiatry, our eyes kind of glaze over. Well, I hope I can make this a little bit more simple for all of us, and so that we can understand it. Neuroses is the plural form of neurosis, and a neurosis is a psychological disorder that arises out of anxiety, stress, and nervousness. It does not have a biological factor in it, and that means it is not genetic. And this is important to understand because it means that anybody can suffer from a neurosis, whether you're overwhelmed with stress at work or whether, as we will see, you're serving and experiencing wartime events. So anybody can suffer from a wartime neurosis. And as we get further in, there's this idea that air crews, military air crews, don't often experience the same psychological stress that ground soldiers face, because on the ground, these soldiers are engaging in hand-to-hand combat, and they're able to see what their weapons are doing to another individual human being. But I'm kind of here to quell that notion that air crews did indeed suffer very similar traumatic events that ground forces faced. And the symptoms and illnesses that they faced were also very similar. And today, this would be known as post-traumatic stress disorder, of course. But at the time, this definition did not exist. And so for that reason, these are called flight neuroses. And next slide, please. To begin, being that this symposium was organized around the anniversary of D-Day, I wanted to discuss a little bit about the need for air power and the role that air power played in Operation Overlord, which we know as D-Day. So this question, the need for air power, why is it needed? The answer to that question would differ according to who you were to ask. If you were to ask General Harry Hap Arnold, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Forces during World War II, what his goal for his Air Force was, he would respond, quote, "To destroy the enemy Air Force wherever you find them, in the air, on the ground, and in the factories," end quote. In other words, Hap Arnold wanted the Air Forces to create and maintain air superiority by demolishing the enemy, whether it was in air-to-air combat or whether it was through the strategic bombing campaigns in the war. And with these strategic bombing campaigns, that's where the destruction on the ground and in the factories came. And this air superiority would provide multiple benefits. The obvious answer being that the Allies would have the best Air Force. They wanted the best pilots. They wanted the best aircraft in order to make the war effort a bit easier on the ground forces. Another benefit was the ability to cripple enemy production and supply trains. And so, for example, very well-known missions concerning air power are the Schweinfurt raids in October 1943 and the destruction of facilities where the Germans created ball bearings. And ball bearings, for example, were a target because they were they were needed in so many different items necessary for the war effort. For example, aircraft use ball bearings, or tanks use ball bearings, or vehicles use ball bearings. And by providing an obstacle to the production of these things, the Allies could gain an air superiority and weaken Germany's war effort. But if you were to ask Dwight D. Eisenhower what his goal for air power was, he would respond, quote, "to support his invasion forces for Operation Overlord," end quote. Operation Overlord is what we now know as D-Day, and it's interesting to note that the majority of the bombs that the Army Air Forces dropped in Europe occurred after January 1st, 1944. And this is due to the fact because by October 1943, General Ira Aker, who was the general of the 8th Air Force, he kind of slowed down the strategic bombing campaign over Germany because his casualties were mounting up. At this time in the war, the Army Air Forces did not have the fighter planes capable of flying deep into Germany to protect the bombers. And this, of course, meant more casualties, more deaths, and this weakened Hap Arnold's goal of having a strong Air Force. And so by January, and especially leading into February, the Allies had produced enough P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts with external fuel tanks that could now fly deep into Germany. And all of a sudden, these bombers were protected and escorted by these fighter planes, and German fighter planes were all of a sudden experiencing air-to-air combat over Germany. And this came as a surprise. And the most significant mission actually for the Army Air Forces concerning D-Day actually occurred in February 1944, from February 20th through February 26th, in an operation known as Operation Argument. This is also colloquially known as Big Week. Well, Big Week marked the resumption of the bombing in Germany. And this meant that now the planes, like I said, the fighter planes had the ability to fly and protect these bombers. And the purpose of Operation Argument was to destroy German aircraft production so that the Luftwaffe had no chance to attack Allied forces during Operation Overlord. Ground forces take a much longer time to mobilize and arrive at a destination, whereas air forces can mobilize more rapidly and arrive more quickly. And so the Allies wanted Big Week to destroy this aircraft production so that there would be this, so that the Luftwaffe could not mobilize quickly and impede the ground invasion in Normandy. And during this week, between February 20th and February 25th, there were approximately 6,000 bombing raids, and this was a maximum effort mission. And during these few days, there were nearly 10,000 tons of bombs dropped, and the losses amounted to 226 bombers and 28 fighter planes. And while every casualty is significant, the numbers of these casualties were actually relatively insignificant compared to the losses that the Germans took. In fact, the Germans experienced nearly 30% loss of their fighter pilots and more than 50% of their readily available aircraft. And these numbers exclude the damage that the Army Air Forces wreaked on the aircraft production, which it delayed by more than 2 months. And while this was an important mission for D-Day, this was also a very special mission for Army Air Force commanders such as Hap Arnold, because they hoped that it would prove to other leading military commanders such as Eisenhower or George C. Marshall that the United States needed an independent Air Force. As historian Brian Blount argues, Army Air Force commanders wanted to use, quote, the air campaign against Germany as a platform to fight for organizational independence. Next slide, please. And apart from that operational success that the Army Air Forces experienced with Big Week, there was also this idea that the Army Air Forces needed successful flyers in order to prove its independence and prove that the Army Air Forces were in capable hands. And these men were supposed to be physically strong. They were supposed to be mentally strong. And that's because during this period in America, there was this idea that men were supposed to be tough in both physically and mentally, but they were supposed to be stoic as well, because they were, and when I say stoic, that means they were supposed to kind of maintain themselves and repress their emotions, because if they were looked down upon if they expressed their vulnerable emotions, and this was not good for an Air Force that was trying to build its identity. There was also this idea that men at this time needed to be willing to sacrifice themselves for the war effort, especially for the United States of America. And this led to the idea that military personnel believed that men needed to undergo a successful childhood development in order to be successful flyers. And this is because at the time, Sigmund Freud's teachings were recently translated to English from German. And Freud's theories on psychology and psychiatry really revolve around this idea of experiencing a proper childhood development. And if a child developed correctly as in his youth, then he or she would be more psychologically strong as an adult. And such attributes included participation in physical sports, because one, this led to physical fitness, but it also developed a sense of competition in these men. Another idea was that children should not have been predisposed to temper tantrums or excessive fears. And as my advisor comically wrote one time when she was looking at my paper, had the psychiatrists ever met a toddler? Because we know that that temper tantrums are very common among toddlers. Either way, the Army Air Forces in particular wanted this type of man in order to protect its image. Plus, at this time, there was this idea that flight was relatively new and it was dangerous and only daring men were flyers. And so society actually believed that military air crews were a new type of supermen. And we see this ideal type of masculinity in this recruitment poster. And I'd like to kind of dive into what this poster means and analyze it a little bit. Other than this physical specimen that we see at the center of the image, the thing that catches my eye the most is the title, "O'er the Ramparts We Watch." We know that quote comes from the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem. And to be honest, throughout my life, I've just repeated this phrase, right? But I've never looked into what a rampart was or what ramparts were. And so the definition of a rampart is a fortified city or a fortified wall that protects a city. And so evoking patriotism among these men, it was giving off this idea that these men were sent to be willing to sacrifice themselves and watch over the nation. And by doing so, they were proving to themselves, the country, and others that they were willing to do everything it took to protect the United States, both physically, but also everything the United States stood for, such as its moral character and everything else. The next thing that draws our attention among this busy propaganda poster, we see the clouds in the background. We see the bombers at the bottom of the poster. But the thing at the center is this physically fit man. He has a straw jawline, and he has these broad shoulders. And I don't know how much a bomb weighed, but I'm sure it weighed a couple hundred of pounds. And so we see this man physically fit carrying this heavy bomb. But there's more to this. This bomb also represents the tool that will be loaded, into an aircraft later to be used against the enemy in protection of this country. And so by carrying this weapon, it is demonstrating that this man is willing to destroy the enemy in protection of everything he stands for and his family stands for. And in addition to these masculine demeanors, this masculine demeanor that we see here, this physically fit man and the strong man, it is important to note that most members of the air crew received a commission to become an officer. And with that commission, they also received unique aviation badges. Next slide, please. Here, the aviation badge becomes a symbol of the successful flyer. And each member of the aircrew had a unique badge that reflected their job in the aircrew. For example, the pilot had his own unique badge, whereas the bombardier and the navigator, they each had different badges that reflected their jobs and what they accomplished in the aircrew. And this is important because, one, it teaches that the aircrew could not be successful without every member of it contributing to the mission. The plane would not be able to fly without the pilot, of course. Then the bombardier, without the bombardier, the bombs would not deploy accurately. And then, of course, with the navigator, without the navigator, the planes would have no idea where they are or where they would be going. And so these badges reflected these jobs. But more importantly than that, they also made these men feel as if they were true men who had accomplished something that very few had done. According to military psychiatrists Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, who were both psychiatrists for the Army Air Forces, they argued that these badges and their commissions also, quote, satisfied a desire for the prestige of rank, end quote. So with these badges, these men felt like they now deserved a new type of respect and a new type of prestige. And they were tangible items that proved that men had entered into an elite brotherhood of flyers. In reality, these badges form the essence of these flyers' identities. And I want to draw our attention to this propaganda poster now. Whereas in the previous image, we saw how busy it was. We saw the man holding the bomb. We saw the clouds. We saw the multiple bombers at the end. And then we saw the many words on that poster. But on this poster, it is very simple. It is very clean. And we see the word fly. And then below that, U.S. Army Air Forces. And whereas this flyer is not the physical specimen that we saw in the previous poster, he is a caricature. But all of your attention is drawn to the radiating badge on this flyer's chest. And as this flyer marches along proudly, he is pointing at his badge, giving this idea that anybody who joins the Army Air Forces has the ability to wear the badge with pride. And this relates back to the idea of creating a strong identity for the Army Air Forces. The problem, though, is not everything was as good as it was when you're wearing the badge or whether you're holding the bomb. Combat eventually took its toll on flyers. And much like ground soldiers who experience traumatic events, air crews also experience very similar events that cause psychological stress and eventual emotional breakdown if they were not treated. Next slide, please. And we see this with something called flying fatigue. If we look at this image, we don't see the individual human. We don't see the individual human engaging in hand-to-hand combat or firing his weapon at an enemy. Instead, we see multiple bombers. We see multiple B-17s that are flying in tight formation. But if you look, you see many puffs of black smoke. And as you might have guessed, these black puffs of smoke represent the exploding shells that German anti-aircraft weapons shot into the air, known as flak. And flak shells, once they reached altitude, they exploded with enough force that it sent shrapnel through that often penetrated the aircraft. And if it was a direct hit, it could cause catastrophic damage immediately to an aircraft. And if it was not a direct hit, it could still cause enough damage that made it so difficult for the aircraft to return that it was likely to crash upon return to airbase. But again, I want to emphasize that we don't see the individual human in this poster. Instead, we see this formation. And it is important to note that as these bombers are flying, they cannot break from their formation. Doing so would result in the vulnerability of fellow aircraft, but also it would mean that the mission was likely unsuccessful because the bombs would not be deployed correctly or accurately. And that could also lead to the destruction of fellow American flyers, because if the bombs were dropped incorrectly, they had the chance to hit one of these other bombers. And so these pilots and these flyers that are inside these aircraft, they cannot deviate from the set standard, from the set path. And so if they see these shells going off and exploding, they have to fly right through that. And imagine the psychological stress that has on these flyers, knowing that they cannot deviate, because if they did, they could face potential punishment upon return to the airbase. But also, if hit with a flak shell, there would often be enough shrapnel that caused death or dismemberment to members of the aircrew inside the plane. And these members served together and through intimate and hazardous experiences. And in this confined space, they were all susceptible to seeing firsthand what flak and shrapnel could do to fellow aircrews. And I also want to share another experience with you that comes from Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, the psychiatrists I mentioned before. And because they had taken the Hippocratic Oath, I apologize for the vagueness, but they did not reveal any names of those involved in this following case. But during World War II, a B-17 bomb crew had finished its mission to weaken enemy defenses in preparation for the ground forces' invasion of Italy. The crew became lost at night over Tunisia, and they could not locate their base. And so the pilot then ordered his men to prepare their parachutes and eject from the plane because it had now run out of fuel. Almost every member of the aircrew was able to escape safely. The pilot, however, went down with the plane. And because of the dark sky and because it was at night, the co-pilot did not know whether his friend, who he had served with for so long, had survived. So the next day, when the sun arose, they searched for him. And according to this pilot, they found his body, quote, charred and smashed among the twisted wreckage of the plane, end quote. So, as I said, these men had served together through multiple hazardous missions, and they created intimate connections that only members of the aircrew could make. And once he saw his pilot in this vulnerable state, it caused him to suffer from severe anxiety and depression. But after finding the body, nearby Tunisians rescued this crew and returned them safely to base. And upon return, the co-pilot continued to exhibit continued to feel his severe anxiety. But he did not disclose that fear, and he did not disclose the feelings he had because, remember, at the time, these men were supposed to be stoic. And if he did disclose those, he was challenging that identity that the Army Air Forces were constructing. So he continued to push through, and he continued to fly many missions after. But during a later mission, he witnessed the death of another friend, and his previous experience came back to haunt him. And according to Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, quote, he had so much anxiety that the flying experience was like a nightmare, and he could scarcely keep his mind on the job, end quote. I share this experience with you because not only did these men experience psychological stress in the air, but they also experienced traumatic events when they saw the wreckage, or they also experienced traumatic events on the ground when they saw the wreckage or bodies or anything associated with them. And psychological stress was not uncommon. Actually, historian Mark Wells teaches that there were approximately 5,000 emotional casualties in the 8th Air Force alone. And officers knew that every man was eventually going to suffer from some sort of stress brought on by his occupation. And because of this, they labeled one flying neurosis as flying fatigue. And this was not stigmatized. In fact, it was viewed as normal because it was so common. The important thing, and you'll hear me repeat flying fatigue multiple times within the next few minutes, because it's going to be important for us to understand this word and what it means. Flying fatigue, fatigue demonstrates that the flyers were working hard to fulfill their duty. They were willing to continue to fly in combat after they had experienced their psychological stress. And even if they continued to face that, they were still pushing themselves forward to fulfill their duties as an American flyer. And when we think of fatigue, we often think of this idea that we are working ourselves we are pushing ourselves beyond the limit to the point where we are exhausted, where we feel overworked. And we often hear about fatigue among professional sports players who continue to play despite all the exertion they're giving. And it was the same thing with flying fatigue. Officials gave this diagnosis, flying fatigue, if the flyer continued to push forward and if he did not shirk his duty by requesting to be removed from duty. And I want to share another personal experience with you. A few months ago, a woman reached out to me named Lisa Adam. Her father had recently passed away, and she came across his documents from World War II. And he did not, her father, his name was Yake Adam, and his name spelled Jake, but he went by Yake. He did not disclose very much about his military service. And so upon his passing, she came across documents that said that he suffered from severe flying fatigue. And she did not know what that meant. So she Googled that, and she came across my master's thesis, which discusses flying fatigue a little bit. And so she reached out to me, and we had a great conversation over the phone. And she, next slide, please. And she shared these documents with me, and what they meant to her. So I'm going to go ahead and just read them word for word because I think they're very powerful and they're important for us to understand. The picture on the left says, "It is recommended that Second Lieutenant Leonard J. Adam, pilot, be evacuated to the United States because of severe flying fatigue. This officer has flown approximately 400 hours of combat during the period that he has been on active duty in this squadron. Quite a few of these missions have not only been long and tedious, but extremely hazardous also. These factors have all been directly responsible for the production of his fatigue. And although he shows no more than a normal anxiety, I find it highly desirable that he be evacuated to the zone of the interior for a period of rest. After complete recuperation, he will be able to return to a full combat status in this or any other theater." So Yake Adam flew over 400 combat hours, which amounted to nearly 54 combat missions. And the important factor about this is this letter came from the flight surgeon, and it is this flight surgeon who recommended that Yake Adam be removed from combat due to his severe anxiety. Yake Adam did not voluntarily request to be removed or evacuated. And so it was also important to note that at the end of this, the flight surgeon stated that Yake Adam would be able to return to combat after a complete rest and relaxation. And Yake Adam did return to combat. I also want to read this picture on the right now because it is also important and it reiterates and emphasizes the things that we just read. Lieutenant Adam has always been an excellent pilot and has done very excellent work on numerous occasions. He has been checked out as first pilot since his inception into the squadron, but had to fly with his original crew since he was unable to get a crew of his own. Because of the long, tedious missions he has had to fly of late, he has begun to develop a state of anxiety and nervousness. Rest leaves have been adequate, but have failed to alleviate the symptoms. It is recommended that he be returned to the United States for rest and relaxation. After rehabilitation, he should be able to return to his duties as a member of a combat crew. And it is this next sentence which I want to emphasize. His character is excellent. This goes back to the idea that the Army Air Forces wanted these successful flyers to create and bolster its image. They wanted men of excellent character that were not going to shirk their duties. They wanted men that would continue to fly in the midst of their psychological stress. And if they did experience psychological stress, they wanted men that would continue to fly once they received rest. But the problem, as we know, next slide, please. In this photo, we actually have a picture of Yake Adam and his companion. And this photo was taken when he was evacuated due to his severe flying fatigue. Yake is the man on the right with the smirk. And on the left, he has his companion with the grin from ear to ear, right? But I wanted to draw our attention to a couple of things in this image. First, it looks like these men are dining out and they're having a good time. We see that they're having their alcoholic drinks, but I thought it was funny that we see the staple of all World War II servicemen, the Lucky Strike cigarettes. I also wanted to draw attention to these men's chests and their uniforms. We see the distinct and unique aviation badges and how they differ from one another, but they stand out prominently on their uniform. And as we will get into this next, please notice that Yake Adam is, by looking at him, you would not be able to tell that he is suffering from severe anxiety, from severe nervousness, and from a severe flying fatigue. Instead, it looks like he's just out enjoying his time. But as we know, psychological stress often harms a person enough that they cannot return to combat status. And it is here where we begin to see the stigmatization of mental illness in the Army Air Forces. And those unable to return were diagnosed with something known as a lack of moral fiber. And we can contrast this with flying fatigue, whereas flying fatigue gives us off this idea that men are exerting themselves to continue to fly. A lack of moral fiber is pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty much saying that these men don't have the necessary characteristics to continue to fly in the midst of their psychological stress. So I'd like to share another anecdote with you from Roy Grinker and John Spiegel. During World War II, a flying instructor in the United States Army Air Forces suffered from extreme psychological distress. And during one flight, he had ominous feelings of an impending disaster after seeing the plane right next to him explode into a fireball during combat. Overwhelming anxiety temporarily incapacitated this man, and he could no longer fly the plane. So his co-pilot had to take over. Upon return, after meeting with a psychiatrist, he told the doctors, quote, that he had a yellow streak up his back a yard wide, and he did not know where he got it. That he never used to be yellow, end quote. With the fact that this man was unwilling to return to combat, and with his declaration that he was yellow, commanders could now revoke this airman's commission, remove him from flight status, and reassign him to basic ground duties. They could even remove him from the service in general because of this declaration. And by explicitly stating that he felt yellow, he was acknowledging that this man acknowledged that he felt like a coward for failing to fulfill his responsibilities as a member of an aircrew, and that he was not living up to the standards that the Army Air Forces had set for its men. But not only did these flyers themselves feel like they were cowards, as this man stated, but officers often labeled their issues as this lack of moral fiber because they were unwilling or unable to return to combat. And by using such labels as this, the officers created a culture of stigmatization of mental health issues in the Army Air Forces. And this is difficult because there was an extremely fragile line between flying fatigue and a lack of moral fiber. In fact, one flight surgeon named W.F. Cook even said that not all cases of lack of moral fiber are as clear-cut and obvious. Flight surgeons could not often tell whether the man was suffering from a severe anxiety on the inside or some other obstacle, as W.F. Cook puts it. So the question then arises, how did members of the Army Air Force decide whether a man suffered from flying fatigue or if he had a lack of moral fiber? Well, as I said, one of the issues returned to combat or if he did not. If the man was willing to return to combat or able to return to combat, then he was treated and he received rest and relaxation. But if he was unwilling or unable to return, then that's when he received the pejorative diagnosis of a lack of moral fiber. But there was also another factor, and the Army Air Forces created an administrative process that further stigmatized this issue. And I do not personally think that the Army Air Forces intentionally tried to stigmatize psychological stress, but they did not have the knowledge that we have today. and the stigmatization was an unintended consequence of the following process. So first, when a flyer declared that he could no longer fly due to a psychological issue, the commanding officer ordered him to visit something known as the Central Medical Examining Board. And this board was made up of 5 medical officers who did not always have training in fields of psychology or psychiatry. Can you go ahead and go to the next slide, please? I'd like to read the purpose of this Central Medical Examining Board because it is important and it shows how the Army Air Forces tried to distinguish between flying fatigue and lack of moral fiber. So this image reads, a Central Medical Examining Board will consider the physical qualifications for flying duty of the following individuals when physical examination of such individuals is indicated and will submit recommendations to the command surgeon for action. So in this one paragraph, we see the word physical twice. Because they did not have the knowledge that we have today, medical experts relied and administrative experts relied on physical manifestations of psychological illness. Today, we know that psychological illness does not always have a physical manifestation, as we saw in that image with Ye Gadam. He looked just fine, and no one would know what he was suffering on the inside. But this Central Medical Board had the purpose to decide whether a man that was suffering psychologically was physically qualified to fly or whether he was physically disqualified to fly. And if the flyer was physically disqualified because of his stress, then he did receive the treatment and he would receive rest and relaxation. But if the board deemed that the flyer did not have a physical disqualification, they judged that the man was physically qualified but unwilling to meet military stresses. And it was then that this case became a case of lack of moral fiber. And so if this was the judgment, if the Central Medical Board judged that the flyer was physically qualified but unwilling to fly, the board then sent the flyer to stand before another a flying evaluation board. Next slide, please. So let's contrast the purpose of the Flying Evaluation Board with the purpose of the Central Medical Board. This image reads, a Flying Evaluation Board is a board of investigating officers appointed for the purpose of studying professional qualifications of rated flying personnel only, who hold currently effective aeronautical ratings and making recommendations regarding their future utilization in the performance of flying duty. Whereas the Central Medical Board was made up completely of medical officers, the Flying Evaluation Board was made up of 4 senior rated officers, 2 flight surgeons, and then 1 officer with legal training. And it did not rely on the physical qualifications because the Central Medical Board had already made that judgment. So now it was the judgment of the Flying Evaluation Board to judge whether the man was professionally qualified, or in other words, if the man had an excellent character, as is the case with Ye Gadam. And if it was now this board's job to decide whether this flyer should continue in the Army Air Forces or if he should undergo a punitive process that would potentially remove this flyer from his flight status, reassign him to basic ground duty, or even remove him from the service in general. Again, if the flyer did not have a physical disqualification, meaning that he was physically qualified but unable or unwilling to fly, this Flying Evaluation Board took all of these facts into account and made the judgment, quote, that the officer possesses undesirable habits or traits of character, lack of fundamental courage, or similar facts, end quote. This board then suggested that this man lacked in moral fiber, that he did not have an excellent character, that he did not have the fundamental courage to represent the Army Air Forces. And if this was the case, this board then suggested reclassification, which meant reassignment to ground duties or removal of commission, or they suggested a removal from the service in general to the commanding officer of the numbered Air Force. And it was then this commanding officer's job to determine the punishment. Please go to the next slide. And here I'm going to discuss just a few of the consequences that these flyers faced. As I said, if their case wasn't too bad, then they were just removed from flight status and reassigned to ground duties, which of course was pretty embarrassing for flyers who had worked so hard to become members of this elite brotherhood of airmen. But another consequence, if we read this top image, is that the individual be indefinitely suspended from flying status, that he not be allowed to wear the aviation badge. This recommendation will be made only in cases involving clearly substantiated refusal to fly, fear of flying, fear of combat, or where the individual commits an act constituting a serious willful violation of flying regulations, and demonstrating a marked lack of proficiency in the performance of flying duties and inherent characteristics of personality rendering him unfit for the performance of useful flying duty. In short, what this consequence is saying is, if the case was deemed a case of lack of moral fiber, commanders removed this man's badge that he had worked so hard to get. And as we talked about at the beginning, this badge represented everything the man had accomplished. It represented that he was needed as a member of an aircrew, that he believed he needed a certain type of respect and prestige that came with the commission and the badge. And in essence, by removing the aviation badge, commanders also removed a main part of a flyer's identity. And this, in turn, kind of represented a symbolic emasculation, because by removing a flyer's identity, what would he have to fight for now? Now, if we move on to this next image, I'm going to read some parts of it. It says, when an officer has exhibited unwillingness or refuses to meet the stresses imposed by military situations, and evidence indicates that his elimination for the service as an officer is in the best interest thereof, action will be initiated recommending him for reclassification. Now, if we skip 2 sentences, reclassification action or resignation will be initiated and accomplished in accordance with existing Army Air Force instructions. However, in flagrant cases of refusal to fly, serious willful violations of flying regulations, or other appropriate cases, strong disciplinary action, such as general court-martial, is indicated. And there were indeed court-martial cases due to a lack of moral fiber. So not only did this man have his identity removed through his badge, but he also faced a potential dishonorable discharge through a court-martial. And if the case was not deemed serious enough to go to a court-martial, then a flyer received an other than honorable discharge. And these discharges are very important to understand, because after the war, they would have significant impacts on a person's identity, because at the time, potential employers would look at men's discharge papers to determine if they were worthy enough for a job. And if there was a dishonorable discharge or an other than honorable discharge, these were stigmas that lasted with these men for the rest of their lives. And so here we see kind of that perpetuation of the stigmatization, not only in the Air Forces, but in life afterwards. And I think it's interesting that this process further stigmatized the flyer, because he experienced 3 different judgments that added to his psychological stress. One from the Central Medical Board that judged him to be physically qualified but unwilling to do his duty. Another judgment from the Flying Evaluation Board suggesting that this flyer lacked intestinal fortitude, or that he lacked the fundamental courage. Then finally, he faced another judgment from the commanding officer of the Air Force that determined whether he would be court-martialed, whether he would receive an other than honorable discharge, or whether he would just be removed from flying status, which in itself was embarrassing for these flyers. So in my concluding remarks, I just kind of want to reemphasize that this topic, these flight neuroses or psychological disorders among military air crews, they require a deeper examination. They are very nuanced and oftentimes difficult to understand because of the various different differences between flying fatigue and a lack of moral fiber. But so for this reason, they require that examination. And if a flyer, and officers were so scared of flyers who easily crumbled under this psychological stress because they pose a direct challenge to the Army Air Force's identity that it was trying to construct, especially this idea that the Army Air Forces were full of men who qualified as a new type of Superman. And as a military branch that was trying to prove that it required organizational independence, any flyer unable to fulfill his duty or unable to live up to the standards that the Army Air Forces had set had, quote, ceased to be of any value to the service, end quote. And overall, this topic is historically significant because it shows the creation and the perpetuation of a culture of stigmatization that continues today. With the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we often read about the psychological issues that returning military personnel are facing, and how, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, and how those problems have led to increased suicide rates and other negative consequences. Well, many military personnel today continue to fear. They do not want to share their psychological issues with others because of this fear of stigmatization, which has historical precedents. And this culture of stigmatization of mental health originally was created and perpetuated in the Army Air Forces during World War II. And so thank you very much again for this opportunity to share my research.
Thank you so much, Jorden. We are going to jump right into questions, and we do have a few. So we'll start with, do you think we still have the same tendency to want individuals to be stoic, especially individuals in positions of authority?
I believe so, and I believe that's, I think that's, like I said, the perpetuation of a culture that the military has created since its foundation. And I think the armies and other branches of the military are trying to incorporate a culture shift to make it so that these illnesses won't be stigmatized. But it is very hard to kind of throw away tradition that has lasted for over 100 years.
All right. In your research, did you determine if the Purple Heart Medal was awarded for flying fatigue or battle fatigue?
To be honest, I do not know the answer to that. If it was awarded for flying fatigue, which was not stigmatized, and it was judged that they could not because of their physical manifestations, I am almost certain that they did receive the Purple Heart, but I don't want to say yes for sure. But I think that goes back to this idea that that psychological problems needed a physical manifestation, because that was true evidence of suffering, if that makes sense. And so we know that, of course, the Purple Heart is awarded to those with physical wounds. I'm sure the same can be said of those suffering psychologically with physical manifestations.
All right. Okay, so we have several questions around the topic of lack of moral fiber. So the next 3 questions will be about that. So the first one says, was the diagnosis lack of moral fiber given after a refusal to keep flying?
Yes. Okay. And that's where we see the administrative process. If they refuse to fly, that in itself is, officers believe that they were trying to shirk their duty because they weren't willing to stand up to that stress that every other flyer had to face. And so that's where that administrative process comes in, is if they refuse to fly, of course, they're going to be deemed cowards through a lack of moral fiber.
Okay. Could the diagnosis, lack of moral fiber, be given while not in combat for a flyer that refuses to fly?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but if I'm understanding it correctly, like maybe in training, maybe if they're not in combat but stationed in the United States through training or something like that.
Perhaps someone who had been in combat was sent home and then they wanted to send him back. Perhaps maybe that's what they're asking.
Yeah, I think this lack of moral fiber, it stands across the board, because it whether you're in combat or not, if you're unwilling to meet the military stresses that you were drafted for or signed up for, then you're failing to fulfill your responsibilities according to these officers, and that in turn is evidence of cowardice or this lack of moral fiber.
All right. Final question on lack of moral fiber. Did you find out if the diagnosis was more prevalent among bomber crews as opposed to fighter pilots or fighter crews?
Absolutely. And fighter pilots did suffer from flying fatigue and a lack of moral fiber, but less so because they actually had control of what they were doing in the war. They had control whether they were going to engage in a dogfight, or they could make maneuvers to avoid, flak or even potential bullets from a member of the Luftwaffe. So fighter pilots were less likely to suffer from flying fatigue and lack of moral fiber, whereas bomb crews, they're in this enclosed capsule, if we want to say it, an enclosed aircraft, and really the only person who has control of the aircraft is the pilot. And if he is unable to, and he would be punished if he deviated from the set mission path, because as I said, that could lead to an unsuccessful mission, or it would leave other aircraft vulnerable. And so because these members of the aircrew did not have control over what was happening, the stress of the unknown really affected the flying fatigue and kind of led to this psychological stress.
Okay. All right. So did you conduct any research on other flyers, like the Navy, other branches of the armed services, Navy, Marines, Air Force?
I did not.
Theater.
I do have research from the United States Air Force when it becomes an independent branch in 1947, and especially in the Korean War, because this issue continues into the Korean War and creates a whole new set of problems for this independent Air Force. But regarding Navy or Marine flyers, I have not looked into that.
Okay. So I am all about taking the past and bringing it into the present, making it relevant. So the next two questions are kind of about the present day. So in your earlier, in your presentation, you talked about the propaganda, and it was these strapping, strong men, because of course, women were not able to be pilots. So now, though, presently, we have women fighter pilots. Has any research been done, or did you do any research that compares flight fatigue between men and women, if either one of them suffers it to more than the other? Because you have this idea of it's a manly thing. So, now all these years later, what are we finding out?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I appreciate very much, because that is one of the limits of my research. Is I don't have that research yet, but that is something I want to look into, especially because of the WASPs, which were the women air service pilots in World War II. They weren't allowed to fly in combat, but they would ferry aircraft here and there. And I want to know because these women saw this opportunity as a way to prove themselves to men that they could do everything a man could do. And so I want to look into whether for my PhD dissertation, whether these women also suffered psychologically, and if so, why? And if not, why not? Were they were they least likely to suffer because they had such a strong goal to prove themselves to the Air Forces and to the country that they deserve to be right there next to the men? And so I do not have an answer to that yet, but it is something that I am going to get into.
All right. Okay. And I think this is the last question. I don't see any more in the chat, but did you look at how they handle flight fatigue presently? And do you find that it's changed much in World War II?
The furthest I've recently got is to the 1950s. But I know that with the studies that have been done that have looked back at like World War II or Korea, the same regulations are still in effect that were in effect in Korea. And so I think we have to take into account the fact that the air war has changed drastically since World War II. And we're not accustomed to 8 to 10 men in a bomber crew. Now it's fighter pilots that do have the ability to control or engage in maneuvers at their will. And so I do not know recently, but up until they still go by the same regulations, including the flying evaluation boards.
That's interesting that they still use the same regulations. I think it'd be interesting to see if someone does that study. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions, so we're going to take a brief pause. Go get some water, go stretch your legs, whatever you need to do. And we'll be back at just a few minutes at 11 o'clock to talk to Jorden and do our Scholar Spotlight with him. So really quick, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to the Roosevelt and Truman Libraries. Please, if you're not going to stick with us for the 30 or so minutes, please join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time for day 3 of our Emerging Scholars Symposium, where we will hear from Kendall Cosley. And so join us, please stay with us, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much for hanging out with us for a little bit. So we're going to do what we call the Scholar Spotlight, where we are going to learn just a little bit more about our scholars. So again, thank you, Jorden, for that great presentation. Really learned a lot. This is my favorite part of this symposium. Is I'm a lifelong learner, so I get to learn new things. So we'll jump right into these questions. So tell me first, what drew you to this topic?
Okay. Well, first off, Joy, thank you so much for moderating this and everything. What drew me into this topic? To be honest, I went blind into this topic. And are you at Eisenhower?
Not currently. I am in sunny Florida for about 2 more weeks.
Okay. So I received my master's degree from Kansas State University. And so I was able to attend the Eisenhower Presidential Library quite a few times, actually, to engage in some research. And going into grad school, I was wanting to write about NASA and space and just these different things because I've always been intrigued by, especially the Mercury 7 astronauts. So at Kansas State, I wrote a paper looking at the influence of the Korean War and on the Mercury 7 astronauts, because most of them had served in the Korean War. Well, and so I did some research at Eisenhower. So it's cool how things come full circle. But something that caught my mind was how these astronauts, you know, we know who they are now, but at the time they said they could not express their fear, especially. So as astronauts, they could not be scared. And they learned that from Korea because they could not express their fear. And I wanted to know why. And that's where I kind of dove into this. And I found what they call in Korea as a fear of flying. And it's pretty much the same thing, just not a lack of moral fiber. So they have but it was still stigmatized, and they still had, one historian even says that the boards question the patriotism of any flyer who flew or who declared a fear of flying. And so I wanted to know more, and that's where I found that, oh, these men have experienced have experienced traumatic events, much like ground soldiers, but they're being stigmatized for it. And why is that? Well, because as an independent, as a force that was trying to prove its independence and that it deserved independence, they were trying to create an especially masculine culture. And so that's how I came to this topic, and it's been overwhelming at points, but it's been good.
It's interesting how we get to the things that interest us. You know, we start with, we start in one place and then we go down rabbit holes, but those rabbit holes can sometimes lead us into, this vast, information network. And then we find out there's so much we don't know.
Exactly. And there's still so much about this I don't know, which is scary, but it's also intriguing because that's what keeps us going. Is we want to get to the bottom of it, but do we ever think we'll get there? I don't know, but it's fun because we get to keep going.
Absolutely. All right, the next question. So actually kind of segues into this next question. Tell me a little bit about your research methods, your process for building this topic.
So as I said, I came across this when these astronauts were saying they couldn't express their fear. And if they were scared, they wouldn't say they wouldn't tell the truth. And that is the problem I've experienced with my research and with these methods. I want to get these personal accounts. I want to hear from these men that experienced a lack of moral fiber. But people don't want to write about that. They don't want to tell the truth about that because of this fear of stigmatization, right? Mm-hmm. And so most of my research methods have focused on approaching it through the medical personnel who have great documents, and who have taken great notes, and also from the administrative personnel who are the commanding officers and who are the leaders of the squadron commanders and everything, because they both approach this problem differently, as we see with the Central Medical Board and then the Flying Evaluation Board. So that's where my research and my methodology is mostly focused, is on these two competing organizations. But with my dissertation, I'm hoping that I can find something great, not great, but something that kind of sheds light on how the men themselves feel, because I have the cases from the psychiatrist saying that, oh yeah, I have a yellow stripe up my back a yard wide. They're saying they feel like cowards, but I want to learn that from the flyers themselves. And that's been the issue, though.
Right. I think that's really interesting that, all these years later, there still aren't a lot of these accounts, because again, there was this propaganda of you have to be this manly man, and, they don't want to seem like they were a coward. But I also wonder, and this is not something you have to answer, this is just where my thought process is going. I wonder again, if today's psychiatrists were to look at these same records, how would they approach it? How would they approach how these men felt? And also, I would say, hopefully, maybe the children of these men, or someone who can speak to their story, might see this program and reach out to you and want to share.
That would be a dream come true. But I'm sure, yeah, with today's knowledge, if this, I don't know, but today's psychiatrists would approach this very differently, because, as I said, Freud was such a significant influence on the psychiatrists at the time that they were kind of only focusing on Freud's theories and his childhood development theories. Whereas today we have so much knowledge about the brain and what stress triggers in the brain and the chemicals it sends throughout the body and everything, that they'd actually have more empirical evidence to approach these cases differently.
Agreed. All right. So you've kind of answered this one, but if you want to go into a little bit more detail, what did you find to be your biggest challenge with studying and researching this topic?
Yep, I guess I did answer that. I'm sorry. I guess I need to stop talking a little bit.
No, it's okay. Just, if you want to dig a little deeper, you can. If you don't, we can move on. Yeah,
so other than the fact that I cannot find these personal stories of men saying, yeah, I suffered from a lack of moral fiber, or I was diagnosed with a lack of moral fiber, is the fact that even the military, even the Army Air Forces at the time, did not know how to approach this problem. It was very new, because even in World War I, the United States had a limited amount of experience in the air war, right? Because we were only in the war for such a short time. And so World War II was really the first war where these psychiatrists, these administrative personnel, are really experiencing on a significant, where they're experiencing significant numbers of psychological issues among air crews. And because of that, there is a lack of, what's the word I want to use? The diagnoses weren't always clear. They didn't know whether it qualified for flying fatigue or lack of moral fiber, or if it qualified as something completely different. There were so many variations of psychological stress that has made it very difficult to concisely be able to share what I've learned. And that makes it hard on me, because I want to make sure that I am getting everything right, because nuance is what we're here for, right? We want to know exactly what happened. And the documents from flying fatigue and lack of moral fiber really do make that difficult, because even the medical personnel and administrative personnel really didn't know what they were dealing with at the time. And so that's another aspect that has made this very difficult.
I can imagine, yeah, them not knowing what they were dealing with, but also, these men not really wanting to share and really talk about it. I imagine that would make it difficult to properly document this information. And then on top of not, properly documenting, but also, the perspective of which they were documenting would make it a little bit difficult to research. What I would also be curious about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I did, and that's another issue is the administrative personnel and the medical personnel, as I said, approach these topics differently as well. And actually psychiatrists in the Army Air Forces really became kind of angry once the administrative personnel kind of created this administrative process to deal with these lack of moral fiber cases, because they wanted it black and white. There was no shades of gray in between. Whereas medical personnel really believe that there is an issue here, we just don't know what. And so they agreed with the nuance, the shades of gray, as I said, whereas the administrative personnel, they really wanted it, okay, can he fly or can he not? Because we need to make a decision and move on, kind of thing, so that's a big factor in that. So
I'd be curious to see how other countries dealt with flying fatigue and how they documented it.
So lack of moral fiber actually was a phrase we adopted from the Royal Air Force. Yeah. And they were a lot more harsh than the Army Air Forces were in World War II. If a man was deemed a case of lack of moral fiber, they would march the man in front of his squadron and in front of the different air forces and remove his badges and everything in front of everybody. So it was a very embarrassing, stigmatizing event.
Wow. When you said more harsh, I was like, how could you be more harsh than what they're already doing? But now I see.
Yeah.
Wow. That is harsh. All right. Well, we'll move on. So what surprised you most as you were doing your research, if anything?
Yeah. I did believe, I never really thought about these experiences that these air crews experienced. I knew that they experienced, of course, war. You don't ever want to experience that, because I can't even imagine the knowledge of knowing the damage you're inflicting on somebody else. And so war would never be good, but actually reading how these cases affected these men was very surprising, and the pain that they felt and how it really did impact them for the rest of their lives, whether it was returning home and feeling like they couldn't help their family anymore because they reverted to like being disabled or something like that. Even though they weren't physically disabled, they couldn't be there completely for their families psychologically. And so I think that the lasting effects of war among military air crews has really been the most surprising thing.
Wow. I can imagine now that we know more and more about PTSD, that would be a big factor, or that would be something those men were suffering from, probably undiagnosed for years and years and years.
Yeah. And they didn't receive help for it, because again, that goes back to, well, one, PTSD wasn't an official diagnosis until after the Vietnam War, but also these men kind of still lived with that idea that they had to be stoic, and their wartime was something sacred to them that they shouldn't share, especially when it came to how they felt on the inside.
Yeah, I can imagine having to carry that around every day. What's next for Jorden? What's next for you research-wise? Where are you taking your research? What's next for you career-wise, education-wise? Tell us about Jorden.
Yeah, okay. I'm pretty boring, to be honest with you.
You're probably not boring.
I don't know. I'm a PhD student, so I'm focused on getting work done. And right now, I'm hoping to become a PhD candidate very soon, hopefully by the end of summer or even the fall. And I'm working on getting ready for my exams and everything for that. In terms of where I want this research to go, I love this topic because I have dedicated so much time into it and put so much effort into it. And it is overwhelming at times. And sometimes I'm sick of it and don't want to go forward and but I think it's just the fact that, what we put into it is what we'll get out. And so I'm going to write my dissertation on this topic, looking at it throughout the 20th century. And that's my goal. And instead of just focusing on World War II, I want to expand it throughout the 20th century. But also, of course, it's every academic's dream to have their dissertation published into a book and find a job. And, we just got to make sure we're working hard and doing everything we can to have those outcomes come true.
Well, I am certain that that will come true. And when the book on flight neurosis comes out, I'm going to remember the name Jorden Pitt, and I'm going to invite you back to the Eisenhower Library and Museum to tell us all about it. And I can say I remember when, and we'll celebrate your accomplishment.
That sounds great to me. And it'll be fun because that's where the idea came from, the Eisenhower Presidential Library. So
it'll really be full circle then.
Yep. Well, anyways, thank you to the Eisenhower, Truman, and Roosevelt libraries and the National Archives for this opportunity, because it is edifying to be able to share what we've learned and share it with others. So.
Well, you're absolutely welcome. And thank you so much for your time and for this interesting presentation. It has been a wonderful day and a wonderful experience. So thank you to everyone who stuck with us, who's tuned in. Tomorrow, we'll be right back again at 10 a.m. Central for day 3. And we will talk to Kendall Cosley about how D-Day shaped G.I. Joe, which sounds very, very, very interesting. So please come back, and we'll see you tomorrow. And thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.